Good morning. So nice to see all of you. Thank you very much for being here for the forum. Today is our first forum of the fall season. We're very grateful to be together again. Are you ever disillusioned by narrow theologies, church dysfunction, and constricted readings of Scripture? Does your faith ever begin to feel too small? My guest today is Debie Thomas, an important voice in religious writing today. In her new book, A Faith of Many Rooms, Inhabiting a More Spacious Christianity, she asked the question, what if the faith we inhabit is roomier than we thought? Debie is also the author of Into the Mess and Other Jesus Stories, Reflections on the Life of Christ. She is a columnist and a contributing editor for the Christian Century, and from 2014 to 2024, she served as a lay minister for formation at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Palo Alto, California. She is now a seminarian at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. Debie knows what it's like to wrestle with fundamentalism and to seek a more capacious faith. Today, we're going to be talking about her deeply personal and profoundly theological journey and what sorts of ruptures and revisions it takes to find a more spacious faith and then to inhabit that faith with authenticity and joy. Debie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's
what
a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and it was such a pleasure reading your book. I just feel like I've been immersed in your life, especially the last few days.
Thank you.
My mother's from abroad and my father's from America.
Okay.
And so I think about my family's impressions of America when they first got here.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your parents' experience when they first arrived. Like, what were their impressions of the U.S. and how have those opinions about things here in America changed?
That's a great question. So they came as students, and so, not much money. They were the first in their family and really in our community from South India to come to the Boston area, which is where they settled. So they had no family, no one to kind of embrace them and take them in at first. And so I think in the very beginning it was lonely. It was cold. They were used to tropical South India weather, and Boston is not that. So that took some time to get used to. And then the usual changes of, food, nothing is spicy here, and those sorts of things. But in time, as they got rooted in a church, they found the community just so loving. People embraced them, cared for them, helped them to make that cultural transition.
Yeah, that's right. Church is an important way that we become part of a new community.
Absolutely.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about your two churches when you were a child?
Yeah.
Like they're both so different.
Yeah.
And you probably got something different out of each one of them.
Very much. So my father's retired now, but he was a pastor, and he actually pastored two different congregations. So in the morning, we'd go to what I called American church. That was the church that he was on paid staff. He was an associate there. And that was a large, very multi-ethnic evangelical church in Boston. And that was much more sort of formal, not as high church as the Episcopal Church, but definitely more, the worship was more scripted. We had the bulletins. It was very kind of staid. And then in the afternoons, he pastored an Indian congregation. This was for immigrant families who wanted to worship more in the style that they had been used to in India. And that was much more charismatic. We didn't have bulletins. It was kind of as the Spirit led. But also more conservative in terms of gender, for example. The women and the men sat separately. Women, we covered our heads in the services. Women did not participate in leadership. And so for me, growing up, my life felt kind of bifurcated, as it does for many immigrant or bicultural kids. You have your American way of being in the world, and then you kind of code switch over to your Indian way of being in the world. And you learn to do this juggling. And we get good at it, but there's also a kind of confusion around it. Like, in my heart, who am I? Who's the authentic Debie? To what extent am I American? To what extent am I Indian? And what does that all have to do with God? So those were kind of my founding questions growing up.
Yeah, I love that. I loved imagining you as a child. You do such a great job of just kind of like projecting that child energy in there. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like what were your interests as a child? Like what kind of books did you read? What kind of activities did you do? What kind of films appealed to you? That kind of thing.
That's a good question. So my mom had been a teacher in India, but then when she came to the U.S., she didn't feel comfortable teaching in the American setting. So all of that sort of pedagogical energy kind of laser focused on me. I was the firstborn. So
it worked.
It worked, apparently. So she actually, we lived in a very small apartment, but we had a closet that she kind of cleaned out and she turned it into my learning room. This is when I was like 2. And she put up pictures and the alphabet, and she wanted me to be very immersed in language from the time I was very young. So we would read in there. I would learn to write in there. I still remember when she gave me my first little, those little pink journals with the tiny little key that little girls get, and you feel so special because you can write secret things that are just yours. Of course, I'm sure my mom read everything, but I didn't think that then. So that's kind of how I started writing, and I fell in love with writing very young. As far as culture, though, my parents were quite conservative. I wasn't actually allowed to watch movies, which now seems like shocking, but we didn't watch movies. We watched very little TV. So it was mostly books, trips to the library I remember very fondly.
I love that library in Cambridge.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what kind of books were you reading, or do you remember from childhood?
Oh my goodness, I just devoured like the girly books, Little Women and Anne of Green Gables and Little House on the Prairie. And, during those years, there wasn't much available in terms of more ethnic literature. So, Asian American literature is a pretty new field. And so I did want to read books about people who looked like me. I wanted that experience, but it was not available. So I would just read kind of your classic American children's literature.
Yeah, I loved you mentioned you keeping journals as a child, and our daughter has like shelves of journals. And every so often she'll be like, "Oh, Dad, have a look at this," and show me something to read. But it's really interesting to see the stages she went through. I mean, and even just like what were the topics that she thought were worthy of recording in a journal.
Sure.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like the content of those journals over time, because I mean, you were a writer from the time you got that little book with the key.
Yeah. I think a lot of it was, writing was my way of figuring things out. If I didn't know something, I would write my way to some kind of discovery or resolution. And a lot of it was actually around God. I wrote all my prayers. That was one place where I felt like I could be completely honest. Because there was a lot of, especially as a preacher's kid, there's a lot of public, outward-facing,
expectations.
Expectations, a little bit of acting that you have to do. You can't show up in your full self.
I feel so badly. There's that kid over there who no one's talking to. Go talk to that kid.
Yes.
I'm guilty.
I'm sure all pastors do that. And then in the Indian context, children were very much expected to participate spontaneously in the church. And for me, as a preacher's kid, I was always in that chair. And my dad would just get up and, he'd say things like, well, before I preach, Debbie's going to sing a song. And I had no idea what I was going to sing until I got up there. Or Debbie's going to recite a psalm that she's memorized. And I was like, okay. So there was a lot of that. So in my journals, I could just kind of let loose and just be myself. And really agonize a little bit about, what do I believe about God? Who is God? Which version of faith makes sense? And especially as I moved into my teenage years, those questions became very, very poignant and urgent for me.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think part of what's going on is the difference between a childhood faith and an adult faith.
Yes.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because you had your own experience, and then you also have the experience of your children to draw on and understanding, how formation happens.
Absolutely. So I know that, there's the cliche of preachers' kids who hate that identity, and that wasn't actually my experience. I was kind of the little church nerd girl. I liked it. I liked being in the physical space. I thought of it literally as God's house, like we're going to God's house now. I loved following my dad around and looking at his books and all of that. So that childhood faith was very earnest, very, very earnest. But because I was raised in fundamentalism, it was also very black and white. This is the truth with a capital T. These are all the right answers. This is the doctrinal, contract you have to sign. And if you start having doubts about any of that, that means something's wrong with you. You're not praying hard enough. Maybe you've sinned somehow. And so it was very fear-based, of always needing to kind of toe the line. And then, of course, once you get to be a teenager, especially after going off to college and seeing a much bigger world, that black and white really gets challenged. Because, in fact, faith and life is much messier than that. It's full of gray. It's full of ambivalence. And if you haven't been raised to prepare for that, it can feel like an earthquake, which is what it felt like. It felt seismic. And so then there was a lot of wrestling into, can I doubt and still call myself a Christian? Can I struggle with aspects of doctrine and still seek God? Is God male? Is God white? Are some churches the right churches and the other ones the wrong churches? All of these questions were a part of kind of leaving that early childhood faith and moving into something more adult.
When did you experience that?
Yeah, I think the first big sort of shock was going to college. I went to a women's college in Boston, Wellesley, which interestingly, my parents thought they were sending me, they wanted me to go to women's college because they figured that would be kind of safe, like no boys. But in fact, it was this very feminist, wonderfully progressive feminist place.
Yeah.
And I signed up for a religion class. And goodness, it was not what I had learned in church, right? Suddenly I'm reading feminist theology and womanist theology and like, oh my goodness, this is not what I learned in Sunday school. So I think that was the first kind of challenge. Like, oh, there are whole other ways of thinking about this tradition than I've been told. What am I going to do with all this?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, my wife grew up in Hawaii, and so coming to the mainland and studying women's studies was it was a huge change.
It is.
But I mean, in a way, if she'd arrived 10 years earlier, she wouldn't even have been able to have that experience. But it's been hugely formative. Everything she's done there since then has been kind of women's studies. But I wonder if like ethnic studies, women's studies, I mean, they're kind of nascent. They were just starting out.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Did you have any experience with those teachers or with those ideas?
I think they were very patient with me because I had also been raised, in fundamentalism, there's a strong inclination towards apologetics. You always should be defending your faith. Yeah. And so I went into these classrooms at first very defensive, not really open-minded. And so it took a long time to let that posture go and to realize it's not up to me. I don't need to defend God. God doesn't need my defending. God's fine. I can wrestle. I can have questions. It's not up to me to hold this thing up, this monolith that long predates me and will long survive me. It's not up to me. So letting go of that took time.
Yeah, but by the same token, you're part of the conversation in a big way. Yeah. I wonder if you can talk about like teachers, even just from early times to now. I mean, teachers who've influenced you or teachers who you admire.
I've been so lucky that way. I think all of us probably have stories of a teacher who just kind of took us under their wing and cared for us. And for me, it was largely English teachers. And that's probably because I was, more interested in English and literature from the time I was little. So my heart just went out to them. So, from kindergarten on, teachers who would read to us, who encouraged my writing. I didn't so much grow up in a culture that could see that as a way forward vocationally. My parents were fine with my writing for fun, but I was supposed to be dutifully pre-med, which I was for one semester when I got to college. And then I was like, I am so sorry, this is never, ever going to happen. So to have teachers say, you can do this. It's fine to love this. It's fine to love words. It's fine to love books. It's fine to move in the world in this way as a writer. There's something very powerful when someone names something for you, like this is possible. You are a writer, because it's what you love. And so I think that was a real gift that teachers gave me.
Yeah, that is, and it's wonderful that you were able to follow up with it.
Yeah.
During your time doing your MFA, what was that like? Like, how did you go into the program, and then how did you come out of it?
Yeah, so I did eventually. After I got married, we had children, and then my husband and I were taking turns. Like, who gets to go to school now? Who gets to make the next move?
You did the same thing,
vocationally. And after he had done he did actually do medicine, good Indian boy. Then it was my turn. So I decided to do a creative writing degree. And so we were in Columbus, Ohio at the time. So this was at the Ohio State University. And that was a dream 3 years. Just like the privilege of being able to basically get paid to learn how to write and then write. I can't possibly overstate the blessing and privilege of that. I had wonderful teachers. I actually went in thinking I was going to write fiction. That was my dream. Like, real writers write novels and short stories. But then what I ended up producing in these classes was all stuff from my own life, trying to make sense of my own upbringing, my identity, being bicultural. And so these wise teachers, after a while, sat me down and said, we understand that you want to write fiction, but what you're writing is memoir. You write memoir. And I was like, no, I want to write novels. And but eventually I realized, no, they're right. I need to write nonfiction. So that's how that started.
So if I were to go there and start the program, what do you think I would learn after, there? I mean, what would my classes be like? What?
Yeah, so we did take actual literature classes where you're reading other, published authors, but you're reading for craft.
Yeah.
So you're not doing, sort of feminist analysis of Toni Morrison. You're looking at how does she construct her sentences? How does she make metaphor? How does she move her characters from one room to the other? Or if you're, reading memoir, how is this writer taking an experience and then mining it for all of its meanings? How is it working symbolically? So you're reading for craft. You're reading for the art. And just the more you do that, the more you read published authors that way, the more that then seeps into your own writing.
Yeah, I mean, I can just tell that you've spent so many hours reading, and just in order to be able to write this. How did writing for the Christian Century start?
So when we moved to California, that was 12 years ago. That was right when my sort of evangelical upbringing had completely fallen apart. So I was really in a place of faith crisis. And I think it took moving this far away from my family in Boston to finally feel permission to try a different kind of church. And so we were new to Palo Alto. I Googled churches that were progressive, found this church, St. Mark's, and one Sunday morning just walked in just cold. I knew nothing about the Episcopal Church, nothing about any of it, and just fell in love with all of it very quickly. But there was a person there who was the editor of a lectionary magazine called Journey with Jesus, which is reflections on the readings that we have in church every Sunday. And when he found out my background, he asked if I would write some guest essays for him. And at that point, I didn't know what the lectionary was, literally had no idea.
Yeah, right.
So I learned and then ended up writing some essays for him, eventually got hired as one of his staff writers. And then Christian Century, seeing that work, invited me to write for them.
Yeah, you and I may have been in church at the same time. I'd always go there when I was on sabbatical.
Oh, you would? Okay.
We probably sat right next to each other.
We probably did, yeah.
So what struck you when you first came into it, like a much more liturgical church? Like it must have been just very different for you.
So different. I mean, part of it was the draw of the beauty of the liturgy. If you already love words and you walk in and you see this gorgeous poetic language that has been tested and tried over, centuries, there's something so beautiful about that. And I also love the permission to just show up into something that was already formed. There's a lot of pressure, I think, in evangelicalism to make the spiritual experience happen. You have to come with the right posture, you have to feel all the feelings, you have to somehow make it be spiritual. Where I think liturgical traditions more say, here it is. It was here long before you. Show up, rest, and just let it carry you. And I think for me, I was so tired coming out of fundamentalism, I just really appreciated the permission to land and rest and be. I didn't have to make anything happen.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are Christian traditions which emphasize an emotional response so much that it's almost like you're trying to generate that emotional response. Yeah. And it is a relief just to be able to go and
absolutely,
and let God speak to you in whatever way God's going to speak to you. Yeah, that's so interesting. I wonder what it was like for your children as you were kind of becoming part of that community.
Yeah, looking back now, I kind of feel sorry for them because they went through all the deconstruction as I was going through it. So they had to, because when they were very little, we took them to evangelical churches, and that was their first exposure to faith. And then to have me come out of that was hard for them because suddenly they're like, well, we thought it was this way, and now you're saying it's this way, and how does that work? So it necessitated a lot of conversation. But the nice thing is we could have those conversations, as opposed to with my parents, where it would have been far too threatening for them, for me to say, I'm exploring other paths. That was not something they could hold. And so I hope that at least with my kids, because we could talk about it, there was more permission for them to choose or not choose. And in fact, the two of them have chosen very differently. Our son, he's at UCLA right now. He's a senior. on his own has gone and found an Episcopal church, and he's part of a college Bible study and all of that, where our daughter has decided, at least for now, that it's not for her. And so, that's okay. It's, again, I'm not in charge of their stories with God. That's between them and God.
And life is so long.
And life is so long.
So many different things happen.
Yeah.
I think you're the granddaughter of a pastor, you're the daughter of a pastor, you're the daughter-in-law of a pastor.
Yeah.
I just feel like you must know so much that you've learned from them. I wonder just if you could talk a little bit about that experience of these really important figures in your life who are religious leaders.
Yeah. I mean, on the positive side, like steeped in scripture from the time I was very little. We, every morning at it was some horrible hour, like 6 a.m., my parents would go into the living room and they would start singing a hymn. And man, by the time they finished that second verse, you better be up and sitting in the living room. And so my brother and I would be like in our pajamas, like half asleep, but you had to show up. And so they would sing, we would pray together, my dad would read scripture. And so that was very, very formative for me at a young age, because it taught me that questions about God, ultimate questions about meaning, these are not things to take casually. These are foundational. Whatever path you choose, don't be tepid about this because it has consequences. And so to have that instilled in me very young was a gift. So same with when we'd go to India and visit my grandfathers, both of them were very active in their churches and preached and prayed. And so those streams were kind of coming into me very young. My father-in-law, retired now, but was very active in Calcutta, in the heart of the city, working with children who'd been rescued from trafficking and the very poor. And so again, this early formation in service in the name of Jesus was instilled in me. Those are the positives.
Yeah.
The negative, of course, was that they were all men and could only ever be men. And so even though something in me, even at a young age, was yearning towards that, I could feel the hunger for it, there was no embodiment of that I could imagine myself moving into, because women were just not allowed to do it. And so looking back now, as I'm in discernment for the priesthood, there are a lot of questions that come up around, when did you feel the call? Like, when did you know? And there's a part of me that knew as a little girl. I'm sure of it. But there was no permission for a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember meeting the first women who were ordained as priests, and then even I had two professors who were in the Philadelphia 11. Carter Hayward and Frederica Tomset. Okay. But they were incredible teachers. But it really changed the church in a really positive way. I think the more different ideas and perspectives, just the better your decisions are.
Of course.
I was talking to some Jesuit priests this week about just what kind of decisions can you make if no women are involved at the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I wonder what was your father's strengths as a pastor, and what were the things that he didn't gravitate toward as much.
Yeah, he was very much an evangelist.
Yeah,
and so he was all about the good news of the gospel for everyone. And so that was at the heart of his preaching. He was also very much about service. Our home was just constantly open to people. So I can't remember a Sunday when we didn't have so many guests, college students, eating with us, sometimes staying with us if they had nowhere else to go over the holidays, families who had just transitioned to the U.S., didn't have an apartment yet, they would live with us. So my brother and I, we were all constantly being thrown out of our rooms because there were guests who needed to stay. And that was actually a good way to grow up. It taught me hospitality very young, not to hold my possessions, so not to clench those things in my fist, but to be very open-handed with those things. Those were his gifts.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And that, you can tell how deeply steeped in the Bible you are from your writing. I wonder if you can talk about just like different books of the Bible that particularly speak to you, and maybe even just over time too. I know there are different moments in my life that where different sections of Scripture have meant different things to me.
Yeah, I think growing up the Gospels, because I was very drawn to Jesus. I was not sure about God. I was very ambivalent about, is God strict, authoritarian? Is God male? Is God like some kind of Santa Claus in the sky? Who and what is God? That was harder for me. But Jesus, I was drawn to, even as a very little girl, because you could see in the stories of the Gospels how he actually interacted with people. The fact that children were drawn to him. Children are very particular about who they're drawn to. So if kids like you, that's kind of a good sign. The fact that he was so compassionate to women, the fact that he took his time with people and would have these one-on-one encounters, even when the crowds were pressing against him. He didn't allow that to distract him from the importance of one-on-one encounter. So those things really drew me. As I moved into adolescence and young adulthood, I think I really took hold of the Psalms. Because, oh my goodness, all the emotions are there. There's nothing that I can feel that is not somewhere in there. Like rage, sorrow, lament, fear, all of it's in there. And so sometimes when I could not find any words to pray with, the Psalms just became my prayers.
The older I get, the more powerful the Psalms are for me.
Powerful.
And part of it has to do with lament, which you talk about in your book.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like the genesis of the book. Like,
Sure.
How did you begin to find these ideas and start to express them in this form?
Yeah. So I wanted to find a way to write about both like my cultural upbringing, being bicultural, being Asian American, and also my faith. Because for a long time, these two things have felt very separate to me. I'm a Christian over here, and I'm Asian American over here, and I'm not sure how they intertwine with each other. And so again, writing is my way of figuring things out. I wrote the book because I didn't know, and I wanted to find out in the writing how the two are interconnected. As far as just literally how the book came about, a publisher who had seen my work in the Christian Century asked if I'd be interested in doing a book project with them. And so that kind of got me started thinking about these questions. And then I began to really look again at the Gospels with this question in mind. Is there anything about Jesus that I can connect to at the level of my identity? And then it was as if, it was as if I put on a new pair of glasses, because suddenly it just one day dawned on me, there's a way in which I could read Jesus as bicultural, right? He was, our faith tells us that he's the incarnate Son of God, but he was also a first century man in Palestine trying to figure out his human life. And so he had to hold these two identities in a kind of productive, beautiful tension. And I had never thought of it that way before. But once I saw that, it just gave me a way in. Like, oh, here's another way in which I can identify with him and maybe he identifies with me.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about the sections on lament? I mean, one of the things you say is that, as churches lose the ability to talk about suffering and grieving, they lose something essential to their gospel heritage.
They do. So I grew up with what I call happy clappy Christianity. You have to exude joy because we are resurrection people. So, I didn't grow up with liturgical seasons, so we just went straight to Easter. We didn't do Lent. There was no Lent.
No Good Friday.
No. Yeah, maybe a little blip, but it was all about celebration. And of course that has its place in Christianity. But if you skip over everything that comes before that, the fact that Jesus wept many times in Scripture, the fact that he was angry about injustice, the fact that the whole prophetic tradition is about raging against injustice and calling God to account, like show up. Where are the promises that we have depended on? Where are you? And that's okay to ask. It is not faithless to ask those questions. That is actual engagement because it means we're holding on, we're wrestling, we haven't walked away. So I didn't grow up with any of that. And for me, it really came to a head, as I talk about in the book, with my children, because both of them went through pretty significant health crises. And suddenly all of that happy, clappy stuff just fell away. And the kinds of responses I got from some of my Christian friends were deeply wounding. Like, oh, God will never give you more than you can handle, and God is forming them for something wonderful, and, are you praying hard enough for them? I was like, are you kidding me? I'm their mother. So, and I just realized we're missing something. We are missing something if we can't just sit in the presence of somebody who's in the ashes and just be. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to shorten the duration of that. Let them grieve. God is in that. And so after having gone through that myself, now I'm like very sensitive to when other people are in deep sorrow, to just let that be, and not try to fix it, not try to cut that short.
Yeah, it's one of the things I just love about every Sunday. I mean, we have, last night, I do a little sermon before yoga, and I did a little sermon, and a woman came over and told me that, like, one of her closest friends has just been diagnosed with cancer and is going to die.
Yeah.
And she just had tears coming down her face. But Grace Cathedral is a place you can come when you're celebrating, you're full of joy, and it can be a place, and the liturgy is designed so that it'll support you, no matter what.
Exactly. Yeah. And the fact that it's communal, I think, is wonderful too, because
agree.
there's some Sundays when we might not be able to say the happy stuff because we're not feeling it.
Yeah.
But somebody is sitting next to you in the pew, and they will hold that for you. And then there'll be another Sunday when you can do that for them, and they can't. So it doesn't all depend on any one of us because we're doing it together.
Yeah, I love the way it was almost a parenthetical aside where you talked about the beauty of the creeds, the language of the creeds as poetic language. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like the role of the creeds in your faith, and what do they mean? They're so mysterious.
They are so mysterious. And again, I grew up with the creeds being more like the doctrinal thing you have to sign. Yeah. You have to sign that first. You have to be sure of all of those things first before you can pray, before you can be in relationship with God. And that's a lot of pressure, super lot of pressure.
It is.
So now it's become, just the opposite, which is what I'm a little bit still in my honeymoon phase with the Episcopal Church. Like, I know it's not perfect, but
I am too.
There's some good things. But one of the things I love is that the invitation is show up and pray with us. Just come and experience the liturgy, pray. You don't have to sign on a dotted line first. Like that, what God is going to form in you will come over time. It will come in community. The creeds are our connection to the tradition going back centuries, going back millennia. It connects us around the world. It doesn't mean that you intellectually have to understand how and why and to what extent each of these things are true and have to sign that. It emerges, it evolves. You will wrestle with it. This is the story that we've agreed to wrestle with together, and that is enough. So I think that's what it means for me.
Yeah, I do too. I love that part of the book. You talk a lot about just your faith as a woman, and that is such an important part of this book too. So it's not just your bicultural experience, but also your gendered experience. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just how that's evolving too, because you basically are leaving an environment where. I love that conversation you described. When you're 22, you're getting married, and the ladies in the who are cooking the meals with you are talking about what it means to be a woman in your society. I wonder if you could, because I could tell that story, but I'd much rather hear you tell the story.
Yes.
And then what do you do now when all of a sudden that rule, those two sub rules are not quite in place in the same way?
Sure. So. What Malcolm's referring to is the night before I got married, we had a very traditional Indian wedding. So tons of guests come to the house, to the bride's house, and the bride's family throws this huge feast, I think several hundred people. And so the aunts and the grandmothers all come many days before and begin the process of preparing the meal. And my job as a bride was to just sit and help a little bit, but mostly just to hear their stories. Because this is the time when it's kind of like their version of premarital counseling, just the women, and you're hearing all the stories of like how to be a good wife. And it was very interesting to me, because by then, I'd gone to Wellesley and had this whole other feminist thing going on. But to hear them talk about, being women in a culture that did not recognize their authority and power in a formal way, but who in fact wielded a lot of power on the side, or very, very quietly. A lot of these women, they ran the place. They raised their children, they worked sometimes multiple jobs as new immigrants. They did a whole lot in the church that was not formally recognized. And so they were very powerful, but it was a quiet, below the surface power, which they knew. They knew it, but they also deferred to the official line about headship of men. We're supposed to submit. So there was a kind of both and to it, which I was noticing in the way that they told these stories. But then moving out of that, needing for my own well-being to leave that behind. And there was sadness in that, because these are the women who raised me. But then to go and look at scripture and look at our tradition and realize, oh my goodness, there were women in actual official leadership in the church in the first centuries. There's Mary Magdalene, without whom we would not know about the resurrection. There's Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was the first one to say, "This is my body given for you," even before Jesus said it, right? So there's this other very powerful stream of what it means to be a woman. And so there's been grief in leaving the first one behind, but also I feel very much at home now in the second one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that you talk about is the women basically knowing we're the competent ones. Like, our husbands don't even know
how to boil water for tea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's perfect.
Yeah.
And it's a much more mutual relationship that you are describing with your own husband.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, it's just like it's entering the gray area.
Yeah.
And it's not so clear that men do this, women do this.
Right.
We have to figure out who's going to do what in
Exactly.
our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
So now, tell me a little bit about just like your calling to go to seminary, and I would love to know more about that.
So it kind of crept up slowly. Like I said, I think if I think back to my childhood, that hunger was already there, but I'd put it aside as not possible. And then 12 years ago, started attending St. Mark's, eventually joined staff there as a lay minister. And the more I was there, the more I was falling in love with what the priests were doing up front and I could see myself doing that. But again, it took so much time to give myself permission. Like, it's one thing to say, women in the abstract can do this, but it's a whole other thing to say, oh, maybe I could do this, and it would be okay with God if I did it. That took years. But I think it was 3 years ago, it was Holy Week, and our associate pastor was sick and had to go on leave. And so those of us who were on lay staff had to kind of step in and do more than we would otherwise have done during Holy Week. And my rector allowed me to do as much as a lay person is allowed to do up front. So we got through all the services. It was Easter Sunday. I'm standing at the door saying goodbye to people. And someone said to me, "Oh, Debbie, you've been here for every service. You must be exhausted." And in that moment, it was like lightning. I just looked at her and I said, "I am not exhausted." I'm buzzing with electric aliveness. And if there were 3 more services right now, I would be so happy. And she was like, "Okay." So I went home. I was crying. I told my husband, and he was kind of like, "Well, it's about time." So the next morning, my poor rector, the Monday after Easter, who calls their priest the Monday after Easter? But I called him, and I was like, "I have to talk to you right now. And then I was in his office. I was crying. He was crying. And I said, I think I want to do this. I want to start discernment.
Yeah, that's so great.
Yeah.
I know, really. Clapping in the audience. Yeah, it's so beautiful. And tell me a little bit about just kind of what your impressions of your, these next years are going to be like. Like what kind of classes are you going to take?
Yeah. So I'm a year in, so I'm going to Church Divinity School, which is up at Berkeley. The program is hybrid, so I can do a lot of it from home. I am fully nerding out on it. I love it.
Great. Seminary is the best
thing. The best. It's so good. Because you get to study with other people who are just as nerdy and interested in it as you are. You don't feel so weird. Because my kids call me the church lady, because I'm weird, right? We're weird. But when you're in seminary, you get to be with other weird people. So that's nice. But also just to learn in community. A lot of my learning into the Anglican tradition has been by myself, just trying to read it by myself. So it's really nice to actually have professors who know a lot more about this than I do and can form me and push me and redirect me. So right now I'm taking theology, pastoral care, and Christian formation.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Who's your theology teacher?
So Professor Garcia.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, neat.
Really
That's
neat.
neat.
Yeah.
What fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be so interesting to, I guess you can keep a journal too.
Oh, I do, yeah.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah.
When I was in seminary my first year, Heidi lived in East Africa.
Oh, okay.
And so I wrote her a letter every day. And those letters are all about my professors, my first impressions and everything.
Yeah. Oh, it's lovely.
So I forgot to tell you beforehand, but we have a tradition here of people taking questions.
Sure.
So they'll write questions on papers and then send them up.
Okay.
But one of the questions that we were talking about that may be coming up is a question about preaching. Just like what works for you in a preacher, and what did you learn from your dad, and what kind of preaching really speaks to you too. I mean, I can imagine Matt McDermott having somebody with MFA and in the congregation thinks, oh, I wonder what Debbie is going to think of this.
Oh, that's great. No, he was lovely. And although he had to prod for many years before I said yes. Because he invited me to preach, I don't know, at least 2 years before I finally said yes. I kept saying, no. I'm a writer. The nice thing about writing is that you can just put it on the page and send it out. And your actual physical person is not involved in what happens next. But preaching is...
The bad news. The good news, though, is when they love it. I mean, when they're with you.
Sure, of course.
Oh, my gosh, it's so great.
Of course. But it took me a while to get over just the sheer terror of being up there that I could actually engage. I remember the first time I actually did it at St. Mark's. I mean, shaking from like head to toe. But then exactly having that response of love. And of course, it was my church family. So they were just like, yay, little Debbie's preaching her first sermon. So it was very cuddly, which was nice. But as far as preparation, I think when I first started out, I was so scared, especially because the Episcopal Church is not in my bones. And so I was so afraid of getting something wrong. So I would start by just reading a ton of commentary just to make sure I was on the right track because I wasn't confident yet. And it took a while to switch from that and instead say, okay, I'm just going to read the lectionary text and just let them kind of compost for a while. I'll check the experts later. I will do that. But it's okay to have the confidence to just sit with these texts on my own first and see what pops, see what words or images or what aspect of a story is speaking to me. So in an ideal world, I'll read the text, Monday before I have to preach and let it sit for a few days. And then by Wednesday or Thursday, start reading commentary. In a really ideal world, by like Friday night, there's a first draft written. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's just full-on panic at, Saturday midnight and just praying like, God, please do something. I don't know what's happening.
I think you're so wise. I think that if you read commentaries too soon, it prejudges everything.
Exactly.
And you do need to come to your own sense of what the story means.
You do, absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, that'll be another thing. You'll be able to take Hebrew and Greek if you want.
Yes.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that too, because as a bilingual person, I was talking to my daughter who's Spanish, English, and she was talking about just almost having like a kind of a Spanish-speaking self and an English-speaking self.
Okay.
And I wonder if you have any of that just in terms of how language affects how you express yourself and how preaching might be different in your two native tongues.
That's great. Yeah, I'm not fluent enough in Malayalam, my mother tongue, to be able to preach in it. So I've never tried that. But I think I do pay a lot more attention to individual words because I'm really aware of, like, this is an intentional choice. And I'm aware that we're reading in translation. I don't take the English for granted because I know that we're reading, well, Jesus spoke in Aramaic, and then that was translated into Greek, and now we're getting it in English. So I try to pay a lot of attention to that, the journeys of individual words, and to know that those have like connotations and they resonate in different ways for different people. And so sometimes a whole sermon could be just focusing in on a phrase because the phrase is sort of musical or lyrical or poetic in some way that can just speak all by itself. So in that way, I'm grateful to be bilingual because I pay more attention to language in general.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I remember in the book you talk about, just like even the whole truth. The Syrophoenician woman? No, it's another story.
The woman who's bleeding.
Yes, the woman who was with flow of blood.
Yeah.
And you talk about her sharing the whole truth with Jesus.
I love that story.
Yeah, and you just did a great job of it, of just like talking about how time stopped and the two of them had each other's full attention.
Yeah.
And you're right, that's a whole sermon that comes from this recognition of that she told him the whole truth, and recognizing that those words are so important.
Yeah.
I think about the whole truth so often. As I was reading, I was thinking of Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, and I was thinking of St. Augustine's Confessions. Yeah. And so I was wondering just kind of just what your take is on different autobiographical expressions of Christianity and ones that have really spoken to you. You mentioned Barbara Brown Taylor's work.
Yeah, so I just devour everything that she's ever written. I want to be her when I grow up.
What happened to me? So I've read all her sermons.
Okay, yeah.
I've read everything she's written publicly. So one day I'm preaching the sermon, I look up and there she is in the congregation. It was so strange for me to have taken so many ideas from her and to have her actually sitting there in the congregation.
Wow.
It's very, very strange.
Yeah,
situation.
no, she's wonderful. So she was very formative for me. If you haven't read her memoirs, read her sermons, they're beautiful. Yeah. I've also read a lot in my own sort of deconstruction process, a lot of other writers who've come out of that tradition. So there's a lot of writers who write specifically about coming out of evangelicalism. So the late Rachel Held Evans was fantastic.
She was here before, not long before her death.
Okay, yeah. Nadia Bolz-Weber is a Lutheran priest who writes some really fun and wonderfully irreverent work. Very recently, I've been reading Cole Arthur Riley. She's an African-American activist theologian. Her books are gorgeous. And so, I do love to read spiritual memoir. It's one of my favorite genres.
Yeah, and there's something about it, too, that you can say. There's certain kinds of things that you can say in that kind of genre that it just don't come out of like a systematic theology.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question.
Okay.
Many people have crises of faith in seminary, but you describe having had one earlier in life. Have you encountered any theological surprises or changes or new awareness since starting seminary? That's a great question.
So I think, there are these remnants in me that are still, you never fully shed what you grew up with, right? So I'm sitting in theology class or virtually sitting in theology class, and there's still that little bit of, but in the end, finally, what do Episcopalians believe about, about the Trinity or about the resurrection or about the wonderful Episcopal professors like, well, what do you all think? And then we have the conversation. And so, really, again, having to relax into that, I think I'll have to do this my whole life, that we don't have to pin it down, and people can hold a variety of views, and that's truly okay. It's okay with God. It's okay for the church. The whole thing's not going to collapse because of that. I know that intellectually, but it keeps having to seep down because there's a little part of me that's still anxious, but in the end, don't we have to kind of pin it down? And no, actually we don't. So that's still a surprise to me.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine that.
Yeah.
I do remember studying things and feeling like, wow, this is exactly what I believe. There's a whole group of other people who think like this too.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. I remember reading Stephen Neal's Anglicanism. It's like a history of the Anglican Church, and it was very helpful. Because then instead of saying what do Anglicans believe, it's like how did Anglicans in different generations work out these kinds of problems?
Exactly. That it's always been a conversation, a really robust conversation. I think the other surprise to answer the question is just I had not learned Christian history. So in the evangelical church, this is a bit of a caricature, but there's Jesus, there's Paul, and then there's now, and us. And so I really had no sense of the 2,000 years of thinkers, mystics, saints, but also just the horrible, horrible travesties, all the damage that the church has done. I was not fully aware of that. And so to just sit with that, sit with the horrors that we, have inflicted, and to just grieve that was also necessary, but also painful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, every time I see that image of John Calvin in the window, I love John Calvin's theology and I love his passion as a preacher. Yeah. But I think of Michael Servetus, the heretic, and how Calvin responded to him. Yeah. It's just such it's horrible. Horrible way. Yeah. All right, let's see what other question we have here. I'm hearing you today. I'm deeply inspired to do more religious study, to go deeper in a more formal way. Do you have any advice how to find the right program of study? That's a great question.
Yeah. Well, there's always seminary. Seminary is awesome. But I think the Episcopal Church does also have other really good resources for people who might not want to seek ordination, but still want to have like a rigorous program of study. EFM, right? Is that?
Yeah, so we have a really active and vital EFM program. Like Roberta is one of our helpers.
Yeah, so I don't know all the details of it. Is it like a 3-year course or something like that? It's four-year course. Yeah. Where you join a cohort and you really get, I think, a really good, rigorous deep dive into Anglican theology, history, Bible. And so that's a wonderful way to learn, I think, along with other people, if you don't want to do the full seminary thing. Yeah.
Yeah, every time I go past them, because I pass them as I'm going up to my office, I'm so jealous. I want to be reading what they're reading.
Yeah,
I want
of
to
course.
be talking with them and hearing what their observations are.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to learn. And you're right, Christian history is just...
Absolutely. I'll make a plug for my seminary, too. They do have a continuing learning program where you can just take a course online. And they have them in, Bible and theology. So if you go to CDSP's website, you'll find that there are lots of options, and they're very, very reasonably priced.
Yeah, and I also want to make a plug. My teacher, Margaret Miles, wrote a book called The Word Made Flesh, which is a history of Christianity, which is I absolutely love. Just to get, like you say, to know what people in the Middle Ages thought and how different faith was.
Exactly.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I was thinking about as you were just talking was, what are some of the criticisms that you hear from the secular society of Christianity that have merit? Maybe you can talk a little bit about just like our place in society and.
Yeah, it's very hard because I feel like we progressive Christians have been. In an effort to not sound like our fundamentalist siblings, we have been very, very quiet. And in that way, we have ceded the conversation. We have ceded the representation of Christianity to very extreme voices. And so I think a lot of secular people, when they think of the church, they think of, homophobia and sexism and colonialism and racism and, religion, extreme intolerance towards other traditions. Christian nationalism. And so that is what people see. That's what people hear. And that's not their fault. Those are the loudest voices right now. So for me, as a progressive Christian now, I just feel so challenged to how do we hold the line between, yes, being respectful and being polite, but also speaking, not just giving up the rhetoric to the voices that that don't represent us. And so I think that is our work. So be maybe a little less reserved in the way that we present who we are.
Yeah, I think of that often. Many times I'm preaching and I'll say, all of us need to come up with a position on this. We need to be able to explain this. So that's part of it, exactly. Yeah. Each one of us in our little spheres, having a chance to offer a different a picture of who Jesus is and what Jesus was about. Because that one picture is just so dominant in our society.
It is. Yeah.
When you get ordained and you're a priest,
if I'm not supposed to say what,
you will be doing pre-marriage counseling, and you have been married since you were 22. So what kind of advice would you have for couples as they're getting married? What did you learn on your own journey as a married person?
Oh my goodness. Wow, that's such a huge question. There's a lot of merit in patience and seeing that it's a very long journey. You will change. The person who says, I do, will not be the same person in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. You will continue to change. Your partner will continue to change. And so you have to keep saying yes over and over again. Because, the person I was at 22 is now, barely recognizable to me. And so I have to decide again, do I want to say yes? What does it mean to say yes in this moment? A lot of I'm sorry, a lot of I forgive you, a lot of we need to talk, and then a lot of okay, we're just going to laugh about this because we are absurd. We are absurd, messy humans, and if we don't laugh about this, we're going to cry. So let's just be funny about it, and that helps a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think, that my wife was right about a lot more than I realized, that there's a reason for how she's acting. Do you know what I mean? That I have to trust that. You know what I mean? That's what I've learned to do over the time.
Yes.
And I think part of it was just, we do come from such different cultures,
Sure.
my wife and I.
Sure.
And so part of it is just like recognizing that it's not just about us as individuals. It's like there's a lot of other things that are affecting
Yes.
how we
Yes.
are together. And,
Absolutely. And I think my Indianness has helped me with that, because in Indian culture, it's not just two people marrying, two entire extended families are really marrying. And so you definitely carry that. Like, my husband Alex is the product of that whole system, and I am the product of my whole system. And these two systems are always interacting with each other. And sometimes those interactions are going to have friction. My way is like the right way, but he says his way is the right way. So now what do we do? So really honoring the fact that these are two communities coming together, not just two people. Yeah.
Do you have any projects that are coming up or writing? Obviously, going to seminary is a big project. But I just didn't know if you had the next idea for the next book.
Not yet. The publisher has been prodding a little bit. I'm like, I'm writing research papers right now. I'll get back to you in a year or two. So I don't know. I love writing memoir. Again, it's how I figure things out. So whatever the next thing is that I need to discover or figure out will probably be the seed of another book. But I'm not there yet.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for you. I know you're going to be preaching today,
Yeah.
so I definitely want to get you into a place where you can kind of compose yourself and prepare for that. But it's been such a pleasure having you. I wonder if you can talk as we just like wrap everything up about just kind of what signs of hope you see just around us these days. Like what signs of God's grace are you experiencing in your life?
Oh, I love that question. I have a lot of hope in, I think, being a mom and seeing this next generation that is so passionate and so engaged, and they love this planet. They want justice, and they won't put up with not having it. And they're impatient in good ways. And I think I see that in my own children, and I think God is very present in that. And so that provocation, which is coming from those voices, we would do well to listen, really, really listen and honor those voices, because I think they are prophetic voices for us. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope. And again, my Episcopal honeymoon, like this tradition gives me hope. I think we have a way of talking about Jesus and the way of Jesus that is beautiful and robust. We don't have to embellish it. It's really good. All we have to do is speak it and live it. I think if we do that, then there's a lot of reason for hope.
Yeah, I love it. I sometimes think of it almost like a technology for being connected to others and to being connected to God and what's beautiful and true and just and good. And you're right. It's a way that 20 centuries of people like you have contributed to. So everything from having a lectionary and having particular hymns and having particular music that's set, even like religious symbols, like reading the Bible in a particular way. Yeah. It's definitely, and I think you're right. I think my children are a lot wiser when we talk about like women's studies or ethnic studies.
Oh yeah, they're on it.
Yeah, they are in a way that I didn't even have a vocabulary for that.
Right.
And that gives me hope too. I'm glad that you raised that up, because I wouldn't have known that was my answer until you started yours.
Nice. Yeah.
What a joy it is to see you. Thank you so much for coming up. And
Thank you.
I can't wait to hear more about just CDSP and
Thank you.
what happens next in your adventure.
Thank you so much.
I'm so grateful that you said yes to
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you all for coming so early on a Sunday morning. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So I have a few more announcements. Please join me next week when my guest will be our new bishop, the Right Reverend Austin Rios. It will be a wonderful opportunity to get to know him better and to welcome him to our community. You're always welcome to join us upstairs for the Choral Eucharist at 11 a.m. and hear more from Debbie, who is preaching this morning. We rely on you and your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to the number 76278. So THINK to 76278. And you're also able to buy a copy of Debbie's book. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much.